an emotional monotone. Many of Mr. Phillips' shares had been acquired under options at preferential prices not available to others, and moreover, the fact that Mr. Phillips' precise holdings had been included in the proxy statement clearly showed that in the opinion of the Securities and Exchange Commission, his holdings were Mr. Brusati's business. Going on to the matter of the fees paid directors, Mr. Brusati elicited from Mr. Filippi the information that over the past 7 years, these had been raised from $2,500 per annum first to $5,000, and then to $7,500. The ensuing dialogue between the two men went like this. By the way, who establishes those fees? Those fees are established by the board of directors. The board of directors establish their own fees. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brusati. Later on in the morning, there were several lengthy and eloquent orations by stockholders on the virtues of General Electric and of the South. But this rather elegantly elliptical exchange between Mr. Brusati and Mr. Filippi stuck in my mind, for it seemed to sum up the spirit of the meeting. Only after adjournment, which came at 12:30 following Mr. Filippi's announcement that the unopposed slate of directors had been elected and that cumulative voting had lost by 97.51% to 2.49%. Indeed, I realized that not only had there been no stamping, booing, or shouting, as there had been in Detroit, but regional pride had not had to be invoked against the professional stockholders. It had been General Electric's whole card, I felt, but General Electric had won on the board without needing to turn it up. Each meeting I attended had its easily discernible characteristic tone, and that of Chase. Pfizer Company, the diversified pharmaceutical and chemical firm, was amicability. Pfizer, which in previous years had customarily held its annual meeting at its headquarters in Brooklyn, reversed the trend by moving this year's meeting right into the lair of the most vocal dissenters, Midtown Manhattan. But everything that I saw and heard convinced me that the motivation behind this move had been not a brash resolve on the company's part to beard the lions in their den, but a highly unfashionable desire to get the maximum possible turnout. Pfizer seemed to feel self-confident enough to meet its stockholders with its guard down. For instance, in contrast with the other meetings I attended, no stockholder tickets were collected or credentials checked at the entrance to the Grand Ballroom of the Commodore Hotel, where the Pfizer meeting was held. Fidel Castro himself, whose oratorical style I have occasionally felt that the professional stockholders were using as a model, could presumably have walked in and said whatever he chose. Some 1,700 persons, or nearly enough to fill the ballroom, showed up, and all the members of the Pfizer board of directors sat on the platform from start to finish and answered any questions addressed to them individually. Speaking appropriately with a faint trace of a Brooklyn accent, Chairman John E. McKean welcomed the stockholders as my dear and cherished friends. I tried to imagine Mr. Capel and Mr. Filippi addressing their stockholders that way and couldn't, but then their companies are bigger, and said that on the way out, everyone present would be given a big free sample kit of Pfizer consumer products, such as Barbasol, Desitin, and Imprev, wooed thus by endearments and the promise of gifts, and further softened up by the report of President John G. Powers, Jr., on current operations, records all around, and immediate prospects, more records expected. The most intransigent professional stockholder would have been hard put to it to mount much of a rebellion at this particular meeting, and as it happened, the only professional present seemed to be John Gilbert, brother of Lewis. I learned later that Lewis Gilbert and Mrs. Davis were in Cleveland that day, attending the U.S. Steel meeting. John Gilbert is the sort of professional stockholder the Pfizer management deserves, or would like to think it does. With an easygoing manner and a habit of punctuating his words with self-deprecating little laughs. He is the most ingratiating gadfly imaginable, or was on this occasion. I'm told he isn't always, and as he ran through what seemed to be the standard Gilbert family repertoire of questions on the reliability of the firm's auditors, the salaries of its officers, the fees of its directors, he seemed almost apologetic that duty called on him to commit the indelicacy of asking such things. As for the amateur stockholders present, their questions and comments were about like those at the other meetings I'd attended, but this time their attitude toward the role of the professional stockholder was noticeably different. Instead of being overwhelmingly opposed, they appeared to be split. To judge from the volume of clapping and of discreet groaning, about half of those present considered Gilbert a nuisance and half considered him a help. Powers left no doubt about how he felt. Before adjourning the meeting, he said, without irony, that he had welcomed Gilbert's questions and made a point of inviting him to come again next year. And indeed, during the later stages of the Pfizer meeting, when Gilbert, in a conversational way, was praising the company for some things and criticizing it for others, and the various members of the board were replying to his comments just as informally, I got for the first time a fleeting sense of genuine communication between stockholders and managers. The Radio Corporation of America, which had held its last two meetings far from its New York headquarters, in Los Angeles in 1964 and Chicago in 1965, reserved the current trend even more decisively than Pfizer by convening this time in Carnegie Hall. The entire orchestra and the 2 tiers of boxes were completely filled with stockholders, about 2,300 of them, of whom a strikingly larger proportion than at any of my other meetings was male. Mrs. Sauce and Mrs. Davis were on hand, though, along with Louis Gilbert and some professional stockholders I hadn't seen before. And, as with Pfizer, the company's whole board of directors sat on the platform, where the chief centers of attraction in our chaos case were David Sarnoff, the company's 75-year-old chairman, and his 48-year-old son, Robert W. Sarnoff, who had been its president since the beginning of the year. For me, 2 aspects of the ERCA meeting stood out. The evident respect, amounting almost to veneration, of the stockholders for their celebrated chairman, and an unaccustomed disposition of the amateur stockholders to speak up for themselves. The elder Mr. Sarnoff, looking hale and ready for anything, conducted the meeting, and he and several other RCEA executives gave reports on company operations and prospects, in the course of which the words record and growth recurred so monotonously that I, not being an RCOA stockholder, began to nod. I was brought wide awake with a jolt on one occasion, though, when I heard Walter D. Scott, chairman of RCAA's subsidiary, the National Broadcasting Company, say in connection with his network's television programming that creative resources are always running ahead of demand. No one objected to that statement or to anything else in the glowing reports. But when they were over, the stockholders had their say on other matters. Mr. Gilbert raised some favorite questions of his about accounting procedures, and a representative of RCA's accountants, Arthur Young Company, made replies that seemed to satisfy Mr. Gilbert, a Dickensian elderly lady who identified herself as Mrs. Martha Brand and said she held many thousands of shares of RCA stock, expressed the view that the accounting procedures of the company should not even be questioned. I have since learned that Mrs. Brand is a professional stockholder who is an anomaly within the profession, and that she leans strongly toward the management view of things. Mr. Gilbert then advanced a proposal for the adoption of cumulative voting, supporting it with about the same arguments that Mrs. Sauce had used at the GEA meeting. Mr. Sarnoff opposed the motion, and so did Mrs. Brand, who explained that she was sure the present directors always worked tirelessly for the welfare of the corporation, and added this time that she was the holder of many, many thousands of shares. 2 or 3 other stockholders spoke up in favor of cumulative voting, the only occasion at any meeting on which I saw stockholders, not easily identifiable as professionals, speak in dissent on a matter of substance. Cumulative voting was defeated, 95.3% to 4.7%. Mrs. Sauce, still in as mild a mood as in Atlanta, said she was delighted to see a woman, Mrs. Josephine Young Case, sitting on the stage as a member of the ERCEA board, but deplored the fact that Mrs. Case's principal occupation was given on the proxy statement as housewife. Couldn't a woman who was chairman of the board of Skidmore College at least be called a home executive? Another lady stockholder set off a round of applause by delivering a paean to Chairman Sarnoff, whom she called the marvelous Cinderella man of the 20th century. Mrs. Davis, who had earlier objected to the side of the meeting on the ground, which I found dumbfounding, that Carnegie Hall was too unsophisticated for RCA, advanced a resolution calling for company action to ensure that hereafter no person shall serve as a director after he shall have attained the age of 72. Even though similar rulings are in effect in many companies, and even though the proposal not being retroactive would have no effect upon Mr. Sarnoff's status, it seemed to be aimed at him, and thus Mrs. Davis demonstrated again her uncanny knack of playing into management's hands. Nor did she appear to help her cause by putting on a Batman mask, the symbolism of which I didn't grasp when she made it. At all events, The proposal gave rise to several impassioned defenses of Mr. Sarnoff, and one of the speakers went on to complain bitterly that Mrs. Davis was insulting the intelligence of everyone present. At this, the serious-minded Mr. Gilbert leaped up to say, "I quite agree about the silliness of her costume, but there is a valid principle in her proposal." In making this Voltairean distinction, Mr. Gilbert, to judge from his evident state of agitation, was achieving a triumph of reason over inclination that was costing him plenty. Mrs. Davis's resolution was defeated overwhelmingly. The margin against it served to end the meeting with what amounted to a rousing vote of confidence in the Cinderella Man. Classic farce with elements of slapstick was the dominant mood of the meeting of the Communications Satellite Corporation, with which I wound up my meeting. Going season. ComSat is, of course, the glamorous space-age communications company that was set up by the government in 1963 and turned over to public ownership in a celebrated stock sale in 1964. Upon arriving at the meeting site, the Shoreham Hotel in Washington, I was scarcely startled to discover Mrs. Sos, and Louis Gilbert among the 1,000 or so stockholders present. Mrs. Davis, decked out in stage makeup, an orange pith helmet, a short red skirt, white boots, and a black sweater bearing in white letters the legend "I was born to raise hell," had planted herself squarely in front of a battery of television cameras. Mrs. Sauce, as I had learned by now was her custom, had taken a place at the opposite side of the room from Mrs. Davis, and this meant that she was now as far as possible from the television cameras. Considering that Mrs. Sauce does not ordinarily seem to be averse to being photographed, I could write down this choice of seat only as a hard-won triumph of conscience akin to Mr. Gilbert's at Carnegie Hall. As for Mr. Gilbert, he took a place not far from Mrs. Sauce, and thus, of course, a long way from Mrs. Davis. Since the previous year, Leo D. Welch, the man who had conducted the 1965 ComSat meeting with such a firm hand, has been replaced as chairman of the company by James McCormack, a West Point graduate, former Rhodes Scholar, and retired Air Force general with an impeccably polished manner, who bears a certain resemblance to the Duke of Windsor, and Mr. McCormack was conducting this year's session. He warmed up with some preliminary remarks in the course of which he noted, smoothly but not without emphasis, that as for the subject of any intervention that a stockholder might choose to make, the field of relevance is quite narrow. When Mr. McCormack had finished his warm-up, Mrs. Sauce made a brief speech that may or may not have come within the field of relevance. I missed most of it because the floor microphone supplied to her wasn't working right. Mrs. Davis then claimed the floor, and her mic was working all too well. As the cameras ground, she launched into an ear-splitting tirade against the company and its directors because there had been a special door to the meeting room reserved for the entrance of distinguished guests. Mrs. Davis, in a good many words, said she considered this procedure undemocratic. "We apologize, and when you go out, please go by any door you want," Mr. McCormack said. But Mrs. Davis, clearly unappeased, went on speaking. And now the mood of farce was heightened when it became clear that the Sauce-Gilbert faction had decided to abandon all efforts to keep ranks closed with Mrs. Davis. Near the height of her oration, Mr. Gilbert, looking as outraged as a boy whose ball game is being spoiled by a player who doesn't know the rules or care about the game, got up and began shouting, "Point of order! Point of order!" But Mr. McCormack spurned this offer of parliamentary help. He ruled Mr. Gilbert's point of order out of order and bade Mrs. Davis proceed. I had no trouble deducing why he did this. There were unmistakable signs that he, unlike any other corporate chairman I had seen in action, was enjoying every minute of the goings-on. Through most of the meeting, and especially when the professional stockholders had the floor, Mr. McCormack wore the dreamy smile of a wholly bemused spectator. Eventually, Mrs. Davis's speech built up to a peak of both volume and content, at which she began making specific allegations against individual ComSat directors. And at this point, 3 security guards, 2 beefy men, and a determined-looking woman, all dressed in gaudy bottle green uniforms that might have been costumes for the Pirates of Penzance, appeared at the rear, marched with brisk yet stately tread up the center aisle, and assumed the position of parade rest in the aisle within handy reach of Mrs. Davis, whereupon she abruptly concluded her speech and sat down. "All right," Mr. McCormack said, still grinning. "Everything's cool now." The guards retired and the meeting proceeded. Mr. McCormack and the ComSat president, Joseph V. Charik, gave the sort of glowing report on the company that I had grown accustomed to, Mr. McCormack going so far as to say that ComSat might start showing its first profit the following year, rather than in 1969, as originally forecast. It did. Mr. Gilbert asked what fee, apart from his regular salary, Mr. McCormack received for attending directors' meeting. Mr. McCormack replied that he got no fee, and when Mr. Gilbert said, "I'm glad you get nothing, I approve of that," everybody laughed and Mr. McCormack grinned more broadly than ever. Mr. Gilbert was clearly trying to make what he considered to be a serious point, but this didn't seem to be the day for that sort of thing. Mrs. Sauce took a dig at Mrs. Davis by saying pointedly that anyone who opposed Mr. McCormack as company chairman was lacking in perspicacity. She did note, however, that she couldn't quite bring herself to vote for Mr. Welch, the former chairman, who was now a candidate for the board, as much as he had ordered her thrown out last year. A peppy old gentleman said that he thought the company was doing fine and everyone should have faith in it. Once, when Mr. Gilbert said something that Mrs. Davis didn't like and Mrs. Davis didn't like, and Mrs. Davis, without waiting to be recognized, began shouting her objection across the room. Mr. McCormack gave a short, irrepressible giggle. That single falsetto syllable, magnificently amplified by the chairman's microphone, was the motif of the ComSat meeting. On the plane returning from Washington, as I was musing on the meetings I had attended, it occurred to me that if there had been no professional stockholders at them, I would probably have learned almost as much as I did about the company's affairs, but that I would have learned a good deal less about their chief executives' personalities. It had, after all, been the questions, interruptions, and speeches of the professional stockholders that brought the companies to life, in a sense, by forcing each chairman to shed his official portrait, by becrux mask and engage in a human relationship. More often than not, this had been the hardly satisfactory human relationship of nagger and nagged, but anyone looking for humanity in high corporate affairs can't afford to pick and choose. Still, some doubts remained. Being 30,000 feet up in the air is conducive to taking the broader view, and doing so as we winged over Philadelphia, I concluded that, on the basis of what I had seen and heard, both company managements and stockholders might well consider a lesson King Lear learned, that when the role of disinter is left to the fool, there may be trouble ahead for everybody. Chapter 11. One Free Bite. Among the thousands of young scientists who were doing very well in the research and development programs of American companies in the fall of 1962 was one named W. Wolgemuth, who was working for the B.F. Goodrich Company in Akron, Ohio. A 1954 graduate of the University of Michigan, where he had taken the degree of Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering, he had gone directly from the university to a job in the chemical laboratories of Goodrich at a starting salary of $365 a month. Since then, except for 2 years spent in the Army, he had worked continuously for Goodrich in various engineering and research capacities, and had received a total of 15 salary increases over the 6.5 years. In November 1962, as he approached his 31st birthday, he was earning $10,644 a year. A tall, self-contained, serious-looking man of German ancestry, whose horn-rimmed glasses gave him an owlish expression, Wolgemuth lived in a ranch house in Wadsworth, a suburb of Akron, with his wife and their 15-month-old daughter. All in all, he seemed to be the young American home moyen ryushi to the point of boredom. What was decidedly not routine about him, though, was the nature of his job. He was the manager of Goodrich's Department of Space Suit Engineering, and over the past years, in the process of working his way up to that position, he had had a considerable part in the designing and construction of the suits worn by our Mercury astronauts on their orbital and suborbital flights. Then, in the first week of November, Wolgemuth got a phone call from an employment agent in New York who informed him that the executives of a large company in Dover, Delaware, were most anxious to talk to him about the possibility of his taking a job with them. Despite the caller's reticence, a trait common among employment agents making first approaches to prospective employees, Wolgemuth instantly knew the identity of the large company. The International Latex Corporation, which is best known to the public as a maker of girdles and brassieres, but which Wolgemuth knew to be also one of Goodrich's 3 major competitors in the space suit field, is situated in Dover. He knew further that Latex had recently been awarded a subcontract amounting to some $750,000 to do research and development on spacesuits for the Apollo or Moon project. As a matter of fact, Latex had won this contract in competition with Goodrich, among others, and was thus, for the moment, much the hottest company in the spacesuit field. On top of that, Wolgemuth was somewhat discontented with his situation at Goodrich. For one thing, his salary, however bountiful it might seem to many 30-year-olds, was considerably below the average for Goodrich employees of his rank. And, for another, he had been turned down not long before by the company authorities when he asked for air conditioning or filtering to keep dust out of the plant area allocated to space suit work. Accordingly, after making arrangements by phone with the executives mentioned by the employment agent, and they did indeed prove to be latex men, Wolgemuth went to Dover the following Sunday. He stayed there a day and a half, borrowing Monday from vacation time that was due him from Goodrich, and getting what he subsequently described as a real red carpet treatment. He was taken on a tour of the Latex Space Suite, development facilities by Leonard Shepard, director of the company's Industrial Products Division. He was entertained at the home of Max Feller, a latex vice president. He was shown the Dover housing situation by another company executive. Finally, before lunch on Monday, he had a talk with all three of the latex executives, following which, as Wolgemuth later described the scene in court, the three removed themselves to another room for approximately 10 minutes. When they reappeared, one of them offered Wolgemuth the position of manager of engineering for the Industrial Products Division, which included responsibility for spacesuit development at an annual salary of $13,700, effective at the beginning of December. After getting his wife's approval by telephone, and it was not hard to get since she was originally from Baltimore and was delighted at the prospect of moving back to her own part of the world, Wolgemuth accepted. He flew back to Akron that night. First thing Tuesday morning, Wolgemuth confronted Carl Effler, his immediate boss at Goodrich, with the news that he was quitting at the end of the month to take another job. "Are you kidding?" Effler asked. "No, I am not," Wolgemuth replied. Following this crisp exchange, which Wolgemuth later reported in court, Effler, in the time-honored tradition of bereaved bosses, grumbled a bit about the difficulty of finding a qualified replacement before the end of the month. Wolgemuth spent the rest of the day putting his department's papers in order and clearing his desk of unfinished business, and the next morning he went to see Wayne Galloway, a Goodrich Space suit executive with whom he had worked closely and had been on the friendliest of terms for a long time. He said later that he felt he owed it to Galloway to explain to him my side of the picture in person, even though at the moment he was not under Galloway's supervision in the company chain of command. Wolgemuth began this interview by rather melodramatically handing Galloway a lapel pin in the form of a Mercury capsule, which had been awarded to him for his work on the Mercury spacesuits. Now, he said, he felt he was no longer entitled to wear it. Why then, Galloway asked, was he leaving? Simple enough, Wolgemuth said. He considered the latex offer a step up both in salary and in responsibility. Galloway replied that in making the move, Wolgemuth would be taking to latex certain things that did not belong to him, specifically knowledge of the processes that Goodrich used in making spacesuit. In the course of the conversation, Wolgemuth asked Galloway what he would do if he were to receive a similar offer. Galloway replied that he didn't know. For that matter, he added he didn't know what he would do if he were approached by a group who had a foolproof plan for robbing a bank. Wolgemuth had to base his decision on loyalty and ethics, Galloway said, a remark that Wolgemuth took as an accusation of bad faith. He lost his temper, he later explained, and gave Galloway a rash answer. Loyalty and ethics have their price, and International Latex has paid it, he said. After that, the fat was in the fire. Later in the morning, Effler called Wolgemuth into his office and told him it had been decided that he should leave the Goodrich premises as soon as possible, staying around only long enough to make a list of projects that were pending and to go through certain other formalities. In mid-afternoon, while Wolgemuth was occupied with these tasks, Galloway called him and told him that the Goodrich legal department wanted to see him. In the legal department, he was asked whether he intended to use confidential information belonging to Goodrich on behalf of Latex. According to the subsequent affidavit of a Goodrich lawyer, he replied, again rashly, "How are you going to prove it?" He was then advised that he was not legally free to make the move to Latex. While he was not bound to Goodrich by the kind of contract common in American industry, in which an employee agrees not to do similar work for any competing company for a stated period of time, he had, on his return from the Army, signed a routine paper agreeing to keep confidential information, records, and documents of the company of which I may have knowledge because of my employment, something Wolgemuth had entirely forgotten until the Goodrich lawyer reminded him. Even if he had not made that agreement, the lawyer told him now, he would be prevented from going to work on spacesuits for Latex by established principles of trade. Secret's law. Moreover, if he persisted in this plan, Goodrich might sue him. Wohlgemuth returned to his office and put in a call to Feller, the latex vice president he had met in Dover. While he was waiting for the call to be completed, he talked with Effler, who had come in to see him, and whose attitude toward his defection seemed to have stiffened considerably. Wohlgemuth complained that he felt at the mercy of Goodrich, which, it seemed to him, was unreasonably blocking his freedom of action. And Effler upset him further by saying that what had happened during the past 48 hours could not be forgotten and might well affect his future with Goodrich. Wohlgemuth, it appeared, might be sued if he left and scorned if he didn't leave. When the Dover call came through, Wohlgemuth told Feller that in view of the new situation, he would be unable to go to work for Latex. That evening, however, Wohlgemuth's prospects seemed to take a turn for the better. Home in Wadsworth, he called the family dentist, and the dentist recommended a local lawyer. Wohlgemuth told his story to the lawyer, who thereupon consulted another lawyer by phone. The two counselors agreed that Goodrich was probably bluffing and would not really sue Wohlgemuth if he went to Latex. The next morning, Thursday, officials of Latex called him back to assure him that their firm would bear his legal expenses in the event of a lawsuit and, furthermore, would indemnify him against any salary losses. Thus emboldened, Wohlgemuth delivered 2 messages within the next couple of hours, one in person and one by phone. He told Effler what the 2 lawyers had told him, and he called the legal department to report that he had now changed his mind and was going to work at International Latex after all. Later that day, after completing the cleanup job in his office, he left the Goodrich premises for good, taking with him no documents. The following day, Friday, R.G.A. Jeter, General Counsel of Goodrich, telephoned Emerson P. Barrett, Director of Industrial Relations for Latex, and spoke of Goodrich's concern for its trade secrets if Wohlgemuth went to work there. Barrett replied that although the work for which Wohlgemuth was hired was design and construction of spacesuits, Latex was not interested in learning any Goodrich trade secrets, but was only interested in securing the general professional abilities of Mr. Wohlgemuth. That this answer did not satisfy Jeter or Goodrich became manifest the following Monday. That evening, while Wohlgemuth was in an Akron restaurant called the Brown Derby, attending a farewell dinner in his honor given by 40 or 50 of his friends, a waitress told him that there was a man outside who wanted to see him. The man was a deputy sheriff of Summit County, of which Akron is the seat, and when Wohlgemuth came out, the man handed him 2 papers. One was a summons to appear in the Court of Common Pleas on a date a week or so off. The other was a copy of a petition that had been filed in the same court that day by Goodrich, praying that Wohlgemuth be permanently enjoined from, among other things, disclosing to any unauthorized person any trade secrets belonging to Goodrich and performing any work for any corporation other than plaintiff relating to the design, manufacture, and sale of high-altitude pressure suits, spacesuits, and/or similar protective garments. The need for the protection of trade secrets was fully recognized in the Middle Ages, when they were so jealously guarded by the craft guilds that the guild's employees were rigorously prevented from changing jobs. Lay says, fair industrial society, since it emphasizes the principle that the individual is entitled to rise in the world by taking the best opportunity he is offered, has been far more lenient about job jumping, but the right of an organization to keep its secrets has survived. In American law, the basic commandment on the subject was laid down by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in connection with a 1905 Chicago case. Holmes wrote, "The plaintiff has the right to keep the work which it has done, or paid for doing, to itself. The fact that others might do similar work if they wished does not authorize them to steal plaintiffs." This admirably downright, if not highly sophisticated, case has been cited in almost every trade secrets case that has come up since, but over the years, as both scientific research and industrial organization have become infinitely more complex, so have the questions of what exactly constitutes a trade secret and what constitutes stealing it. The American Law Institute's Restatement of the Law of Torts, an authoritative text issued in 1939, grapples manfully with the first question by stating or restating that a trade secret may consist of any formula, pattern, device, or compilation of information which is used in one's business and which gives him an opportunity to obtain an advantage over competitors who do not know or use it. But in a case heard in 1952, an Ohio court decided that the Arthur Murray method of teaching dancing, Though it was unique and was presumably helpful in luring customers away from competitors, was not a trade secret. All of us have our method of doing a million things. Our method of combing our hair, shining our shoes, mowing our lawn, the court mused, and concluded that a trade secret must not only be unique and commercially helpful, but also have inherent value. As for what constitutes thievery of trade secrets, in a proceeding heard in Michigan in 1939, in which the Dutch Cookie Machine Company complained that one of its former employees was threatening to use its highly classified methods to make cookie machines on his own, the trial court decided that there were no fewer than 3 secret processes by which Dutch cookie machines were made and enjoined the former employee from using them in any manner. However, the Michigan Supreme Court on appeal found that the defendant, although he knew the 3 secrets, did not plan to use them in his own operations, and accordingly, it reversed the lower court's decision and vacated the injunction. And so on. Outraged dancing teachers, cookie, machine manufacturers, and others have made their way through American courts, and the principles of law regarding the protection of trade secrets have become well established. Any difficulty arises chiefly in the application of these principles to individual cases. The number of such cases has been rising sharply in recent years as research and development by private industry have expanded. And a good index to the rate of such expansion is the fact that $11.5 billion was spent in this work in 1962, more than 3 times the figure for 1953. No company wants to see the discoveries produced by all that money go out of its doors in the attaché cases, or even in the heads of young scientists bound for greener pastures. In 19th century America, the builder of a better mousetrap was supposed to have been a cynosure, provided, of course, that the mousetrap was properly patented. In those days of comparatively simple technology, patents covered most proprietary rights in business, so trade secrets cases were rare. The better mousetraps of today, however, like the processes involved in outfitting a man to go into orbit or to the moon, are often unpatentable, since thousands of scientists and billions of dollars might be affected by the results of the trial of Goodrich v. Wolgemuth, it naturally attracted an unusual amount of public attention. In Akron, the court proceedings were much discussed, both in the local paper, the Beacon Journal, and in conversation. Goodrich is an old-line company with a strong streak of paternalism in its relations with its employees and with strong feelings about what it regards as business ethics. We were exceptionally upset by what Wolgemuth did, a Goodrich executive of long standing said recently. In my judgment, the episode caused more concern to the company than anything that has happened in years. In fact, in the 93 years that Goodrich has been in business, we had never before entered a suit to restrain a former employee from disclosing trade secrets. Of course, many employees in sensitive positions have left us, but in those cases, the companies doing the hiring have recognized their responsibilities. On one occasion, a Goodrich chemist went to work for another company under circumstances that made it appear to us that he was going to use our methods. We talked to the you was going to use our methods. We talked the man into his new employer too. The upshot was that the competing company never brought out the product it had hired our man to work on. That was responsible conduct on the part of both employee and company. As for the Wolgemuth case, the local community and our employees were a bit hostile toward us at first. A big company suing a little guy and so on. But they gradually came around to our point of view. Interest outside Akron, which was evidenced by a small flood of letters of inquiry about the case addressed to the Goodrich legal department, made it clear that Goodrich v. Wolgemuth was being watched as a bellwether. Some inquiries were from companies that had similar problems or anticipated having them, and a surprising number were from relatives of young scientists, asking, "Does this mean my boy is stuck in his present job for the rest of his life?" In truth, an important issue was at stake, and pitfalls awaited the judge who heard the case, no matter which way he decided. On one side was the danger that discoveries made in the course of corporate research might become unprotectable, a situation that would eventually lead to the drying up of private research funds. On the other side was the danger that thousands of scientists might, through their variability and ingenuity, find themselves permanently locked in a deplorable and possibly unconstitutional kind of intellectual servitude. They would be barred from changing jobs because they knew too much. The trial, held in Akron, presided over by Judge Frank H. Harvey and conducted like all proceedings of its type without a jury, began on November 26th and continued through December 12th with a week's recess in the middle. Wolgemuth, who was supposed to have started work at Latex on December 3rd, remained in Akron under a voluntary agreement with the court and testified extensively in his own defense. Injunction: the form of relief that was sought by Goodrich and the chief form of relief that is available to anyone whose secrets have been stolen is a remedy that originated in Roman law. It was anciently called interdict and is still so called in Scotland. What Goodrich was asking, in effect, was that the court issue a direct order to Wolgemuth not only forbidding him to reveal Goodrich's secrets, but also forbidding him to take employment in any other company's spacesuit department. Any violation of such an order would be contempt of court, punishable by a fine or imprisonment, or both. Just how seriously Goodrich viewed the case became clear when its team of lawyers proved to be headed by Jeter himself, who, as vice president, secretary, the company's ultimate authority on patent law, general law, employee relations, union relations, and workmen's compensation, and Lord High, practically everything else, had not found time to try a case in court himself for 10 years. The chief defense counsel was Richard A. Chenoweth of the Akron law firm of Buckingham, Doolittle Burroughs, which Latex, though it was not a defendant in the action, had retained to handle the case in fulfillment of its promise to Wolgemuth. From the outset, the two sides recognized that if Goodrich was to prevail, it had to prove, first, that it possessed trade secrets, second, that Wolgemuth also possessed them, and that a substantial peril of disclosure existed, and third, that it would suffer irreparable injury if injunctive relief was not granted. On the first point, Goodrich attorneys, through their questioning of Effler, Galloway, and one other company employee, set out to establish that Goodrich had a number of unassailable spacesuit secrets, among them a way of making the hard shell of a space helmet, a way of making the visor seal, a way of making the visor seal, way of making a sock ending, a way of making the inner liner of gloves, a way of fastening the helmet onto the rest of the suite, and a way of applying a wear resistant material called neoprene to two-way stretch fabric. Wolgemuth, through his counsel's cross-examinations, sought to show that none of these processes were secrets at all. For example, in the case of the neoprene process, which Effler had described as a very critical trade secret of Goodrich, defense counsel brought out evidence that a latex product that is neither secret nor intended to be worn in outer space, the Playtex Golden Girdle, was made of two-way stretch fabric with neoprene applied to it. And to emphasize the point, Chenoweth introduced a Playtex Golden Girdle for all to see. Nor did either side neglect to bring into court a spacesuit in each instance inhabited. The Goodrich Suite, a 1961 model, was intended to demonstrate what the company had achieved by means of research that it did not want to see compromised through the loss of its secret. The Latex Suite, also a 1961 model, was intended to show that Latex was already ahead of Goodrich in space suit development and would therefore have no interest in stealing Goodrich secrets. The Latex Suite was particularly bizarre looking, and the Latex employee who wore it in court looked almost excruciatingly uncomfortable, as if he were unaccustomed to the air of Earth or of Akron. His air tubes weren't hooked up, and he was hot. The Beacon Journal explained next day. At any rate, after he had sat suffering for 10 or 15 minutes while defense counsel questioned a witness about his costume, he suddenly pointed in an agonized way to his head, and the court record of what followed, probably unique in the annals of jurisprudence, reads like this: man in the spacesuit. May I take this off? Helmet. The court. All right? The second element in Goodrich's burden of proof, that Wolgemuth was privy to Goodrich's secrets, was fairly quickly dealt with because Wolgemuth's lawyers conceded that hardly anything the company knew about spacesuits had been kept from him. They based their defense on, first, the unquestioned fact that he had taken no papers away with him, and, second, the unlikelihood that he would be able to remember the details of complex scientific processes even if he wanted to. On the third element, the matter of irreparable injury, Jeter pointed out that Goodrich, which had made the first full-pressure flying suit in history for the late Wiley Post's high-altitude experiments in 1934, and which had since poured vast sums into space suit research and development, was the unquestioned pioneer and had up to then been considered the leader in the field. He tried to paint Latex, which had been making full-pressure suits only since the mid-50s, as a parvenu with the nefarious plan of cashing in on Goodrich's years of research by hiring Wolgemuth. Even if the intentions of Latex and Wolgemuth were the best in the world, Jeter contended, Wolgemuth would inevitably reveal Goodrich's secrets in the course of working in Latex's spacesuit department. In any event, Jeter was unwilling to assume good intentions. As evidence of bad ones, there was, on the part of Latex, the fact that the firm had deliberately sought out Wolgemuth, and on the part of Wolgemuth, the statement he had made to Galloway about the price of loyalty and ethics. The defense disputed the contention that a disclosure of secrets would be inevitable and, of course, denied evil intentions on anyone's part. It rounded out its case with a statement made in court under oath by Wolgemuth. I will not reveal International Latex any items which in my own mind I would consider to be trade secrets of the best. This, of course, was cold comfort to Goodrich. Having heard the evidence and the lawyer's summations, Judge Harvey reserved decision until a later date and issued an order temporarily forbidding Wolgemuth to reveal the alleged secrets or to work in the Latex spacesuit program. He could go on the Latex payroll, but he had to stay out of space suits until the court's decision was handed down. In mid-December, Wolgemuth, leaving his family behind, went to Dover and began working for Latex on other products. Early in January, by which time he had succeeded in selling his house in Wadsworth and buying one in Dover, his family joined him at his new stand. In Akron, meanwhile, the lawyers had at each other in briefs intended to sway Judge Harvey. Various fine points of law were debated, learnedly but inconclusively. Yet as the briefs wore on, it became increasingly clear that the essence of the case was quite simple. For all practical purposes, there was no controversy over the fact. What remained in controversy was the answers to two questions. First, should a man be formally restrained from revealing trade secrets when he has not yet committed any such act, and when it is not clear that he intends to? And secondly, should a man be prevented from taking a job simply because the job presents him with unique temptations to break the law? Having scoured the law books, counsel for the defense found exactly the text quotation they wanted in support of the argument that both questions should be answered in the negative. Unlike the decisions of other courts, the general statements of the authors of law textbooks have no official standing in any court, but by using them judiciously an advocate can express his own opinions in someone else's words and buttress them with bibliographical references. The quotation was from a text entitled Trade Secrets, which was written by a lawyer named Ridsdale Ellis and published in 1953, and it read, in part, usually it is not until there is evidence that the employee who has changed jobs has not lived up to his contract, expressed or implied, to maintain secrecy that the former employer can take action. In the law of torts, there is the maxim, every dog has one free bite. A dog cannot be presumed to be vicious until he has proved that he is by biting someone. As with a dog, the former employer may have to wait for a former employee to commit some overt act before he can act. To counter this doctrine, which besides being picturesque appeared to have a crushingly exact applicability to the case under dispute, Goodrich's lawyers came up with a quotation of their own from the very same book. Ellis on Trade Secrets, as the lawyers referred to it in their briefs, was repeatedly used by the two sides to belabor each other, for the good reason that it was the only text on the subject available in the Summit County Law Library, where both sides did the bulk of their research. In support of their cause, Goodrich counsel found that Ellis had said, in connection with trade secrets cases in which the defendant was a company accused of luring away another company's confidential employee, where the confidential employee left to enter defendant's employment, an inference can be drawn to supplement other circumstantial evidence that the latter employment was stimulated by a desire by the defendant to learn plaintiff's secrets. In other words, Ellis apparently felt that when the circumstances look suspicious, one free bite is not permitted. Whether he contradicted himself or merely refined his position is a nice question. Ellis himself had died several years earlier, so it was not possible to consult him on the matter. On February 20th, 1963, having studied the briefs and deliberated on them, Judge Harvey delivered his decision in the form of a 9-page essay fraught with suspense. To begin with, the judge wrote, he was convinced that Goodrich did have trade secrets relative to spacesuits, and that Wolgemuth might be able to remember and therefore be able to disclose some of them to Latex, to the irreparable injury of Goodrich. He declared further that there isn't any doubt that the Latex company was attempting to gain Wolgemuth's valuable experience in this particular specialized field for the reason that they had this so-called Apollo contract with the government, and there isn't any doubt that if he permitted to work in the spacesuit division of the latex company. He would have an opportunity to disclose confidential information of the B.F. Goodrich Company. Still further, Judge Harvey was convinced by the attitude of latex, as this was evidenced by the conduct of its representatives in court, that the company intended to try to get Wolgemuth to give it the benefit of every kind of information he had. At this point in the opinion, things certainly looked black for the defense. However, and the judge was well down page 6 before he got to the however. What he had concluded after studying the one free bite controversy among the lawyers was that an injunction cannot be issued against disclosure of trade secrets before such disclosure has occurred unless there is clear and occurred unless there is clear and occurred substantial evidence of evil intent on the part of the defendant. The defendant in this case, the judge pointed out, was Wolgemuth, and if any evil intent was involved, it appeared to be attributable to latex rather than to him. For this reason, along with some technical ones, he wound up, "It is the view and the order of this court that injunction be denied against the defendant." Goodrich promptly appealed the decision, and the Summit County Court of Appeals, pending its own decision on the case, issued another restraining order, which differed from Judge Harvey's in that it permitted Wolgemuth to do space suit work for latex, but still forbade him to disclose Goodrich's alleged trade secrets. Accordingly, Wolgemuth, with an initial victory under his belt, but with a new legal struggle on his behalf ahead, went to work in the Latex Moon suit shop. Jeter and his colleagues, in their brief to the Court of Appeals, stated unequivocally that Judge Harvey had been wrong, not only in some of the technical aspects of his decision, but in his finding that there must be evidence of bad faith on the defendant's part before an injunction can be granted. The question to be decided is not one of good or bad faith, but rather whether there is a threat or a likelihood that trade secrets will be disclosed, the Goodrich brief declared roundly, and a little inconsistently, in view of all the time and effort the company had expended on attempts to pin bad faith on both latex and Wolgemuth. Wolgemuth's lawyers, of course, did not fail to point out the inconsistency. "It seems strange indeed that Goodrich should find fault with this finding of Judge Harvey," they remarked in their brief. Quite clearly, they had conceived for Judge Harvey feelings so tender as to border on the protective. The decision of the Court of Appeals was handed down on May 22nd. Written by Judge Arthur W. Doyle with his two colleagues of the court concurring, it was a partial reversal of Judge Harvey. Finding that there exists a present real threat of disclosure, even without actual disclosure, and that an injunction may prevent a future wrong, the court granted an injunction that restrained Wolgemuth from disclosing to latex any of the processes and information claimed as trade secrets by Goodrich. On the other hand, Judge Doyle wrote, "We have no doubt that Wolgemuth had the right to take employment in a competitive business and to use his knowledge, other than trade secrets, and experience for the benefit of his new employer." Plainly put, Wolgemuth was at last free to accept a permanent job doing space suit work for latex, provided only that he refrained from disclosing Goodrich secrets in the course of his work. Neither side carried the case above the Summit County Court of Appeals, to the Ohio Supreme Court, and beyond that to the United States Supreme Court. So with the decision of the appeals court, the Wolgemuth case was settled. Public interest in it subsided soon after the trial was over, but professional interest continued to mount. And, of course, it mounted still more after the appeals court decision in May. In March, the New York City Bar Association, in collaboration with the American Bar Association, had presented a symposium on trade secrets with the Wolgemuth case as its focus. In the later months of that year, employers worried about loss of trade secrets brought numerous suits against former employees, presumably relying on the Wolgemuth decision as a precedent. A year later, there were more than 24 trade secrets cases pending in the courts, the most publicized of them being the effort of E.I. DuPont de Nemours Company to prevent one of its former research engineers from taking part in the production of certain rare pigments for the American Potash Chemical Corporation. It would be logical to suppose that Jeter might be worried about enforcement of the appeals court's order, might be afraid that Wolgemuth, working behind the locked door of the latex laboratory and perhaps nursing a grudge against Goodrich, would take his one free bite in spite of the order. The assumption that he would not be caught. However, Jeter didn't look at things that way. Until and unless we learn otherwise, we assume that Wolgemuth and International Latex, both having knowledge of the court order, will comply with the law, Jeter said after the case was concluded. No specific steps by Goodrich to police the enforcement of the order have been taken or are contemplated. Yet if should be violated, there are various ways in which we would be likely to find out. Wolgemuth, after all, is working with others who come and go. Out of perhaps 25 employees in constant touch with him, it's likely that 1 or 2 will leave latex within a couple of years. Furthermore, you can learn quite a lot from suppliers who deal with both latex and Goodrich, and also from customers. However, I do not feel that the order will be violated. Wolgemuth has been through a lawsuit. It was quite an experience for him. He now knows his responsibilities under the law, which he may not have known before. Wolgemuth himself said latte in 1963 that since the conclusion of the case, he had received a great many inquiries from other scientists working in industry, the gist of their questions being, does your case mean that I'm married to my job? He told them that they would have to draw their own conclusions. Wolgemuth also said that the court order had had no effect on his work in the latex spacesuit department. Precisely what the Goodrich secrets are is not spelled out in the order, and therefore I have acted as if all the things they allege to be secrets actually are secrets, he said. Nevertheless, my efficiency is not impaired by my avoiding disclosure of those things. Take, for example, the use of polyurethane as an inner liner, a process that Goodrich claimed as a trade secret. That was something latex had tried previously and found unsatisfactory. Therefore, it wasn't planning to investigate further along those lines, and it still isn't. I am just as effective for latex as if there had never been an injunction. However, I will say this. If I were to get a better offer from some other company now, I'm sure I would evaluate the question very carefully, which is what I didn't do the last time. Wolgemuth, the new post-trial Wolgemuth. Post-trial Wolgemuth. Spoke in a noticeably slow, tense way with long pauses for thought, as if the wrong word might bring lightning down on his head. He was a young man with a strong sense of belonging to the future, and he looked forward to making, if he could, a material contribution to putting man on the moon. At the same time, Jeter may have been right. He was also a man who had recently spent almost 6 months in the toils of the law and who worked and would continue to work in the knowledge that a slip of the tongue might mean a fine, imprisonment, and professional ruin. Chapter 12. In defense of Sterling. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York stands on the block bounded by Liberty, Nassau, and William Streets in Maiden Lane on the slope of one of the few noticeable hillocks remaining in the bulldozed, skyscraper-flattened earth of downtown Manhattan. Its entrance faces Liberty, and its mien is dignified and grim. Its arched ground floor windows, designed in imitation of those of the Pitti and Riccardi palaces in Florence, are protected by iron grills made of bars as thick as a boy's wrist, and above them are rows of small rectangular windows set in a bluff-like 14-story wall of sandstone and a bluff-like 14-story wall of sandstone and limestone, the blocks of which once varied in color from brown through gray to blue, but which soot has reduced to a common gray. The facade's austerity is relieved only at the level of the 12th floor by a Florentine loggia. 2 giant iron lanterns, near replicas of lanterns that adorn the Strozzi Palace in Florence, flank the main entrance, but they seem to be there less to please or illuminate the entrant than to intimidate him. Nor is the building's interior much more cheery or hospitable. The ground floor features cavernous groin vaulting and high ironwork partitions and intricate geometric, floral, and animal designs, and it is guarded by hordes of bank security men whose dark blue uniforms make them look much like policemen. Huge and dour as it is, the Federal Reserve Bank as a building arouses varied feelings in its beholders. To admirers of the debonair new Chase Manhattan Bank across Liberty Street, which is notable for huge windows, bright-colored tiled walls, and stylish abstract expressionist paintings, it is an epitome of 19th-century heavy-footedness in bank architecture, even though it was actually completed in 1924. To an awestruck writer for the magazine Architecture in 1927, it seemed as inviolable as the Rock of Gibraltar, and no less inspiring of one's reverent obeisance, and possessed of a quality which, for lack of a better word, I can best describe as epic. To the mothers of young girls who work in it as secretaries or pages, it looks like a particularly sinister sort of prison. Bank robbers are apparently equally respectful of its inviolability. There has never been the slightest hint of an attempt on it. To the Municipal Art Society of New York, which now rates it as a full-fledged landmark, it was until 1967 only a second-class landmark. being assigned to Category 2, structures of great local or regional importance which should be preserved, rather than Category I, structures of national importance which should be preserved at all costs. On the other hand, it has one indisputable edge on the Pitti, Riccardi, and Strozzi palaces. It is bigger than any of them. In fact, it is a bigger Florentine palace than has ever stood in Florence. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is set apart from the other banks of Wall Street in purpose and function, as well as in appearance. As by far the largest and most important of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which together with the Federal Reserve Board in Washington and the 6,200 commercial banks that are members, make up the Federal Reserve System. It is the chief operating arm of the United States central banking institution. Most other countries have only one central bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of France, and so on. Rather than a network of such banks, but the central banks of all countries have the same dual purpose: to keep the national currency in a healthy state by regulating its supply, partly through the degree of ease or difficulty with which it may be borrowed, and, when necessary, to defend its value in relation to that of other national currencies. To accomplish the first objective, the New York Bank cooperates with its parent board and its 11 brother banks in periodically adjusting a number of monetary throttles, of which the most visible, although not necessarily the most important, is the rate of interest at which it lends money to other banks. As to the second objective, by virtue of tradition and of its situation in the nation's and the world's greatest financial center, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is the sole agent of the Federal Reserve System and of the United States Treasury in dealings with other countries. Thus, on its shoulders falls the chief responsibility for operations in defense of the dollar. Those responsibilities were weighing heavily during the great monetary crisis of 1968, and indeed, since the defense of the dollar sometimes involves the defense of other currencies as well, over the preceding 3.5 years. Charged as it is with acting in the national interest, in fact having no other purpose, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, together with its brother banks, obviously is an arm of government. Yet it has a foot in the free enterprise camp. In what some might call characteristic American fashion, it stands squarely astride the chalk line between government and business. Although it functions as a government agency, its stock is privately owned by the member banks throughout the country, to which it pays annual dividends limited by law to 6% per year. Although its top officers take a federal oath, they are not appointed by the President of the United States, or even by the Federal Reserve Board, but are elected by the bank's own board of directors, and their salaries are paid not out of the federal till, but out of the bank's own income. Yet that income, though happily always forthcoming, is entirely incidental to the bank's purpose. And if it rises above expenses and dividends, the excess is automatically paid into the United States Treasury. A bank that considers profits incidental is scarcely the norm in Wall Street, and this attitude puts Federal Reserve Bank men in a uniquely advantageous social position. Because their bank is a bank, after all, and a privately owned, profitable one at that, they can't be dismissed as mere government bureaucrats. Conversely, having their gaze fixed steadily above the mire of cupidity entitles them to be called the intellectuals, if not actually the aristocrats, of Wall Street banking. Under them lies gold, still the bedrock on which all money nominally rests, though in recent times a bedrock that has been shuddering ominously under the force of various monetary earthquakes. As of March 1968, more than 13,000 tons of the stuff, worth more than $13 billion and amounting to more than a quarter of all the monetary gold in the free world, reposed on actual bedrock 76 feet below the Liberty Street level and 50 below sea level in a vault that would be inundated if a system of sump pumps did not divert a stream that originally wandered through Maiden Lane. The famous 19th century British economist Walter Bagehot once told a friend that when his spirits were low, it used to cheer him to go down to his bank and dabble my hand in a heap of sovereigns. Although it is, to say the least, a stimulating experience to go down and look at the gold in the Federal Reserve Bank vault, which is in the form not of sovereigns but of dully gleaming bars about the size and shape of building bricks, not even the best accredited visitor is allowed to dabble his hands in it. For one thing, the bars weigh about 28 pounds each and are therefore ill adapted to dabbling. And for another, none of the gold belongs to either the Federal Reserve Bank or the United States. All United States gold is kept at Fort Knox, at the New York Assay Office, or at the various mints, the gold deposited at the Federal Reserve Bank belongs to some 70 other countries, the largest depositors being European, which find it convenient to store a good part of their gold reserves there. Originally, most of them put gold there for safekeeping during the Second World War. After the war, the European nations, with the exception of France, not only left it in New York, but greatly increased its quantity as their economies recovered. Nor does the gold represent anything like all the foreign deposits at Liberty Street. Investments of various sorts brought the March 68 total to more than $28 billion. As a banker for most of the central banks of the non-communist world, and as the central bank representing the world's leading currency, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is the undisputed chief citadel of world currency. By virtue of this position, it has afforded a kind of fluoroscopic vision of the insides of international finance, enabling it to detect at a glance an incipiently diseased currency here, a faltering economy that, if, for example, Great Britain is running a deficit in her foreign dealings, this instantly shows up in the Federal Reserve Bank's books in the form of a decline in the Bank of England's balance. In the fall of 1964, precisely such a decline was occurring, and it marked the beginning of a long, gallant, intermittently hair-raising and ultimately losing struggle by a number of countries and their central banks, led by the United States and the Federal Reserve, to safeguard the existing order of world finance by preserving the integrity of the pound sterling. One trouble with imposing buildings is that they have a tendency to belittle the people and activities they enclose, and most of the time it is reasonably accurate to think of the Federal Reserve Bank as a place where often bored people push around workaday slips of paper quite similar to those pushed around in other banks. But since 1964, some of the events there, if they have scarcely been capable of inspiring reverent obeisance, have had a certain epic quality. Early in 1964, it began to be clear that Britain, which for several years had maintained an approximate equilibrium in her international balance of payments, that is, the amount of money she had annually sent outside her borders had been about equal to the amount she had taken in, was running at substantial deficit. Far from being the result of domestic depression in Britain, this situation was the result of overexuberant domestic expansion. Business was booming, and newly affluent Britons were ordering bales and bales of costly goods from abroad without increasing the exports of British goods on anything like the same scale. In short, Britain was living beyond her means. A substantial balance of payments deficit is a worry to a relatively self-sufficient country like the United States. Indeed, the United States was having that very worry at that very time, and it would for years to come. But to a trading nation like Britain, about a quarter of whose entire economy is dependent on foreign trade, it constitutes a grave danger. The situation was cause for growing concern at the Federal Reserve Bank, and the focal point of the concern was the office, on the 10th floor, of Charles A. Coombs, the bank's vice president in charge of foreign operations. All summer long, the fluoroscope showed a sick and worsening pound sterling. From the research section of the Foreign Department, Coombs daily got reports that a torrent of money was leaving Britain. From underground, word rose that the pile of gold bars in the locker assigned to Britain was shrinking appreciably, not through any foul play in the vault, but because so many of the bars were being transferred to other lockers in settlement of Britain's international debts. From the Foreign Exchange Trading Desk on the 7th floor, the news almost every afternoon was that the open market quotations on the pound in terms of dollars had sunk again that day. During July and August, as the quotation dropped from $2.79 to $2.07,890 and then to $2.07,875, the situation was regarded on Liberty Street as so serious that Coombs, who would normally handle foreign exchange matters himself, only making routine reports to those higher up, could stire about it with his boss, the Federal Reserve Bank's president, a tall, cool, soft-spoken man named Alfred Hayes. Mystifyingly complex though it may appear, what actually happens in international financial dealings is essentially what happens in private domestic transactions. The money worries of a nation, like those of a family, are the consequence of having too much money go out and not enough come in. The foreign sellers of goods to Britain cannot spend the pounds they are paid in their own countries, and therefore they convert them into their own currencies. This they do by selling the pounds in the foreign exchange markets just as if they were selling securities on a stock exchange. The market price of the pound fluctuates in response to supply and demand, And so do the prices of all other currencies. All that is, except the dollar, the sun, and the planetary system of currencies, inasmuch as the United States has, since 1934, stood pledged to exchange gold in any quantity for dollars at the pleasure of any nation at the fixed price of $35 per ounce. Under the pressure of selling, the price of the pound goes down, but its fluctuations are severely restricted. The influence of market forces cannot be allowed to lower or raise the price more than a couple of cents below or above the pound's par value. If such wild swings should occur unchecked, bankers and businessmen everywhere who traded with Britain would find themselves involuntarily engaged in a kind of roulette game and would be inclined to stop trading with Britain. Accordingly, under international monetary rules agreed upon at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, and elaborated at various other places at later times, the pound in 1964, nominally valued at $2.80, was allowed to fluctuate only between $2.78 and $2.80, and the enforcer of this abridgment and the enforcer of this abridgment. The law of supply and demand was the Bank of England. On a day when things were going smoothly, the pound might be quoted on the exchange markets at, say, $2.07,990, a rise of 15 cents from the previous day's closing. 15 hundredths of a cent doesn't sound like much, but on a round $1 million, which is generally the basic unit in international monetary dealings, it amounts to $1,500. When that happened, the Bank of England needed to do nothing. If, however, the pound was strong in the markets and rose to $2.82, something it showed absolutely no tendency to do in 1964, the Bank of England was pledged to, and would have been very happy to, accept gold or dollars in exchange for pounds at that price, thereby preventing a further increase in exchange for pounds at that price by preventing a further increase in the price, and at the same time increasing its own reserve of gold and dollars, which serve as the pound's backing. If, on the other hand, and this was a more realistic hypothesis, the pound was weak and sank to $2.78, the Bank of England's sworn duty was to intervene in the market and buy with gold or dollars all pounds offered for sale at that price, however deeply this might have cut into its own nerves. Thus, the central bank of a spendthrift country, like the father of a spendthrift family, is eventually forced to pay the bills out of capital. But in times of serious currency weakness, the central bank loses even more of its reserves than this would suggest because of the vagaries of market psychology. Prudent importers and exporters seeking to protect their capital and profits reduce to a minimum the sum they hold in pounds and the length of time they hold it. Currency speculators whose noses had been trained to sniff out weakness pounce on a falling pound and make enormous short sales in the expectation of turning a profit on a further drop, and the Bank of England must absorb the speculative sales along with the straightforward ones. The ultimate consequence of unchecked currency weakness is something that may be incomparably more disastrous in its effects than family bankruptcy. This is devaluation, and devaluation of a key world currency, like the pound, is the recurrent nightmare of all central bankers, whether in London, New York, Frankfurt, Zurich, or Tokyo. If at any time the drain on Britain's reserves became so great that the Bank of England was unable or unwilling to fulfill its obligation to maintain the pound at $2.78, the necessary result would be devaluation. That is, the $2.78 to $2.82 limitation would be abruptly abrogated. By simple government decree, the par value of the pound would be reduced to some lower figure, and a new set of limits established around the new parity. The heart of the danger was the possibility that what followed might be chaos, not confined to Britain. Devaluation, as the most heroic and most dangerous of remedies for a sick currency, is rightly feared. By making the devaluing country's goods cheaper to others, it boosts exports and thus reduces or eliminates a deficit in international accounts. But at the same time, it makes both imports and domestic goods more expensive at home and thus reduces the country's standard of living. It is radical surgery, curing a disease at the expense of some of the patient's strength and well-being, and in many cases, some of his pride and prestige as well. Worst of all, if the devalued currency is one that, like the pound, is widely used in international dealings, the disease, or more precisely, the cure, is likely to prove contagious. To nations holding large amounts of that particular currency in their reserve vaults, the effects of the devaluation is the same as if the vaults had been burglarized. Such nations and others, finding themselves at an unacceptable trading disadvantage as a result of the devaluation, may have to resort to competitive devaluation of their own currencies. A downward spiral develops. Rumors of further devaluations are constantly in the wind. The loss of confidence in other people's money leads to a disinclination to do business across national borders, and international trade, upon which depend the food and shelter of hundreds of millions of people around the world, tends to decline. Just such a disaster followed the classic devaluation of all time, the departure of the pound from the old gold standard in 1931, an event that is still generally considered a major cause of the worldwide depression of the 30s. The process works similarly in respect to the currencies of all the 100-odd countries that are members of the International Monetary Fund, an organization that originated at Bretton Woods. For any country, a favorable balance of payments means an accumulation of dollars, either directly or indirectly, which are freely convertible into gold in the country's central bank. If the demand for its currency is great enough, the country may revalue it upward, the reverse of a devaluation. Both Germany and the Netherlands did in 1961. Conversely, an unfavorable balance of payments starts the sequence of events that may end in forced devaluation. The degree of disruption of world trade that devaluation of a currency causes depends on that currency's international importance. A large devaluation of the Indian rupee in June 1966, although it was a serious matter to India, created scarcely a ripple in the international markets. And, to round out this brief outline of the rules of an intricate game of which everybody everywhere is an inadvertent player, even the lordly dollar is far from immune to the effects of an unfavorable balance of payments or of speculation. Because of the dollar's pledged relation to gold, it serves as the standard for all other currencies, so its price does not fluctuate in the markets. However, it can suffer weakness of a less visible but equally ominous sort. When the United States sends out substantially more money, whether payment for imports, foreign aid, investments, loans, tourist expenses, or military costs, than it takes in, the recipients freely buy their own currencies with the newly acquired dollars, thereby raising the dollar prices of their own currencies. The rise in price enables their central banks to take in still more dollars, which they can sell back to the United States for gold. Thus, when the dollar is weak, the United States loses gold. France alone, a country with a strong currency and no particular official love of the dollar, required $30 million or more in United States gold regularly every month for several years prior to the autumn of 1966 and between 1958, when the United States began running a serious deficit. In its international accounts, in the middle of March 1968, our gold reserve was halved, from $22.8 billion to $11.4 billion. If the reserve ever dropped to an unacceptably low level, the United States would be forced to break its word and lower the gold value of the dollar, or even to stop selling gold entirely. Either action would in effect be a devaluation. The one devaluation, because of the dollar's preeminent position, that would be more disruptive to world monetary order than a devaluation of the pound. Hayes and Coombs, neither of whom is old enough to have experienced the events of 1930, one at first hand as a banker, but both of whom are such diligent and sensitive students of international banking that they might as well have done so, found that as the hot days of 1964 dragged on, they had occasion to be in almost daily contact by transatlantic telephone with their Bank of England counterparts, the Earl of Cromer, governor of the bank at that time, and Roy Ayalo Bridge, the governor's advisor on foreign exchange. It became clear to them from these conversations and from other sources that the imbalance in Britain's international accounts was far from the whole trouble. A crisis of confidence in the soundness of the pound was developing, and the main cause of it seemed to be the election that Britain's conservative government was facing on October 15th. The one thing that international financial markets hate and fear above all others is uncertainty. Any election represents uncertainty, so the pound always has the jitters just before Britons go to the polls. But to the people who deal in currencies, this election looked particularly menacing because of their estimate of the character of the Labour government that might come into power. The conservative financiers of London, not to mention those of continental Europe, looked with almost irrational suspicion on Harold Wilson, the Labour choice for Prime Minister. Further, some of Mr. Wilson's economic advisers had explicitly extolled the virtues of devaluation of the pound in their earlier theoretical writings. And finally, there was an all-too-pat analogy to be drawn from the fact that the last previous term of the British Labour Party in power had been conspicuously marked in 1949 by a devaluation of sterling from the rate of $4.03 to $2.80. In these circumstances, almost all the dealers in the world money markets, whether they were ordinary international businessmen or out currency speculators, were anxious to get rid of pounds, at least until after the election. Like all speculative attacks, this one fed on itself. Each small drop in the pound's price resulted in further loss of confidence, and down went the pound in the international markets, an oddly diffused sort of exchange, which does not operate in any central building, but rather is conducted by telephone and cable between the trading desks of banks in the world's major cities. Simultaneously, down went British reserves as the Bank of England struggled to support the pound. Early in September, Hayes went to Tokyo for the annual meeting of the members of the International Monetary Fund. In the corridors of the building where participants in the fund met, he heard one European central banker after another express misgivings about the state of the British economy and the outlook for the British currency. Why didn't the British government take steps at home to check its outlay and to improve the balance of payments? They asked each other. Why didn't it raise the Bank of England's lending rate, the so-called bank rate, from its current 5%, since this move would have the effect of raising British interest rates all up and down the line and would thus serve the double purpose of damping down domestic inflation and attracting investment dollars to London from other financial centers, with the result that sterling would gain a sounder footing? Doubtless the continental bankers also put such questions to the Bank of England men in Tokyo. In any event, the Bank of England men and their counterparts in the British Exchequer had not failed to put the questions to themselves. But the proposed measures would certainly be unpopular with the British electorate, as unmistakable harbingers of austerity, and the Conservative government, like many governments before it, appeared to be paralyzed by fear of the imminent election. So it did nothing. In a strictly monetary way, however, Britain did take defensive measures during September. The Bank of England had for several years had a standing agreement with the Federal Reserve that either institution could borrow $500 million from the other over a short term at any time, with virtually no formalities. Now the Bank of England accepted this standby loan and made arrangements to supplement it with another $500 million in short-term credit from various European central banks and the Bank of Canada. This total of $1 billion, together with Britain's last-ditch reserves in gold and dollars, amounting to about $2.6 billion, constituted a sizable store of ammunition. If the speculative assault on the pound should continue or intensify, answering fire would come from the Bank of England in the form of dollar investments in sterling made on the battlefield of the free market, and presumably the attackers would be put to rout. As might have been expected, the assault did intensify after Labour came out the victor in the October election. The new British government realized at the outset that it was faced with a grave crisis, and that immediate and drastic action was in order. It has since been said that summary devaluation of the pound was seriously considered by the newly elected Prime Minister and his advisors on finance, George Brown, Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, and James Callaghan, Chancellor of the Exchequer. The idea was rejected, though, and the measures they actually took in October and early November were a 15% emergency surcharge on British imports, in effect a blanket raising of tariffs, an increased fuel tax, and stiff new capital gains and corporation taxes. These were deflationary, currency-strengthening measures, to be sure, but the world markets were not reassured. The specific nature of the new taxes seems to have disconcerted and even enraged many financiers in and out of Britain, particularly in view of the fact that under the new budget British government spending on welfare benefits was actually to be increased rather than cut back as deflation policy would normally require. One way and another then, the sellers, or bears in market jargon, continued to be in charge of the market for the pound in the weeks after the election, and the Bank of England was kept busy potting away at them with precious shells from its borrowed billion-dollar arsenal. By the end of October, nearly half the billion was gone, and the bears were still inexorably advancing on the pound, 1/100 of a cent at a time. Hayes, Coombs, and their Foreign Department colleagues on Liberty Street, watching with mounting anxiety, were as galled as the British by the fact that a central bank defending its currency against attack can have only the vaguest idea of where the attack is coming from. Speculation is inherent in foreign trade, and by its nature is almost impossible to isolate, identify, or even define. There are degrees of speculation. The word itself, like selfishness or greed, denotes a judgment, and yet every exchange of currencies might be called a speculation in favor of the currency being acquired and against the one being disposed of. At one end of the scale are perfectly legitimate business transactions that have specific speculative effects. A British importer ordering American merchandise may legitimately pay up in pounds in advance of delivery. If he does, he is speculating against the pound. An American importer who is contracted to pay for British goods at a price set in pounds may legitimately insist that his purchase of the pounds he needs to settle his debt be deferred for a certain period. He, too, is speculating against the pound. The staggering importance to Britain of these common commercial operations, which are called leads and lags, respectively, is shown by the fact that if in normal times the world's buyers of British goods were all to withhold their payments for as short a period as 2.5 months, the Bank of England's gold and dollar reserves would vanish. At the other end of the scale is the dealer in money who borrows pounds and then converts the loan into dollars. Such a dealer, instead of merely protecting his business interests, is engaging in an out-and-out speculative move called a short sale. Hoping to buy back the pounds he owes more cheaply later on, he is simply trying to make a profit on the decrease in value he anticipates. And what with the low commissions prevailing in the international money market, the maneuver provides one of the world's most attractive forms of high-stakes gambling. Gambling of this sort, although in fact it probably contributed far less to the sterling crisis than the self-protective measures taken by nervous importers and exporters, was being widely blamed for all the pound's troubles of October and November 1964. Particularly in the British Parliament, there were angry references to speculative activity by the gnomes of Zurich. Zurich being singled out because Switzerland, whose banking laws rigidly protect the anonymity of depositors, is the blind pig of international banking, and consequently much currency speculation originating in many parts of the world is funneled through Zurich. Besides low commissions and anonymity, currency speculation has another attraction. Thanks to time differentials and good telephone service, the world money market, unlike stock exchanges, racetracks, and gambling casinos, practically never closes. London opens an hour after the continent, or did until February 1968 when Britain adopted Continental Time, New York 5, now 6 hours after that, San Francisco 3 hours after that, and then Tokyo gets underway about the time San Francisco closes. Only a need for sleep or a lack of money need halt the operations of a really hopelessly addicted plunger anywhere. It was not the gnomes of Zurich who were beating down the pound, a leading Zurich banker subsequently maintained, stopping short of claiming that there were no gnomes there. Nonetheless, organized short selling, what traders call a bear raid, was certainly in progress, and the defenders of the pound in London and their sympathizers in New York would have given plenty to catch a glimpse of the invisible enemy. It was in this atmosphere, then, that on the weekend beginning November 7th, the leading central bankers of the world held their regular monthly gathering in Basel, Switzerland. The occasion for such gatherings, which have been held regularly since the 1930s except during the Second World War, is the monthly meeting of the Board of Directors of the Bank for International Settlements, which was established in Basel in 1930 primarily as a clearinghouse for the handling of reparations, payments arising out of the First World War, but has come to serve as an agency of international monetary cooperation, and, incidentally, a kind of central bankers' club. As such, it is considerably more limited in resources and restricted as to membership than the International Monetary Fund. But, like other exclusive clubs, it is often the scene of great decisions. Represented on its board of directors are Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland. In short, the economic powers of Western Europe. While the United States is a regular monthly guest whose presence is counted on, and Canada and Japan are less frequent visitors. The Federal Reserve is almost always represented by Coombs, and sometimes by Hayes and other New York officers as well. In the nature of things, the interests of the different central banks conflict. Their faces are set against each other almost as if they were players in a poker game. Even so, in view of the fact that international troubles with money at their root have almost as long a history as similarly caused troubles between individuals, the most surprising thing about international monetary cooperation is that it is so new. Through all the ages prior to the First World War, it cannot be said to have existed at all. In the 1920s, it existed chiefly through close personal ties between individual central bankers, often maintained in spite of the indifference of their governments. On an official level, it got off to a halting start through the Financial Committee of the League of Nations, which was supposed to encourage joint action to prevent monetary catastrophes. The sterling collapse of 1931 and its grim sequel were ample proof of the committee's failure. But better days were ahead. The 1944 International Financial Conference at Bretton Woods, out of which emerged not only the International Monetary Fund, but also the whole structure of post-war monetary rules designed to help establish and maintain fixed exchange rates, as well as the World Bank designed to ease the flow of it. Money from rich countries to poor or war, devastated ones, stands as a milestone in economic cooperation comparable to the formation of the United Nations in political affairs. To cite just one of the conference's fruits, a credit of more than $1 billion extended to Britain by the International Monetary Fund during the Suez Affair in 1956 prevented a major international financial crisis then. In subsequent years, economic changes, like other changes, tended to come more and more quickly. After 1958, monetary crises began springing up virtually overnight, and the International Monetary Fund, which is hindered by slow-moving machinery, sometimes proved adequate to meet such crises alone. Again, the new spirit of cooperation rose to the occasion, this time with the richest of nations, the United States, taking the lead. Starting in 1961, the Federal Reserve Bank, with the approval of the Federal Reserve Board and the Treasury in Washington, joined the other leading central banks in setting up a system of ever-ready revolving credits, which soon came to be called the swap network. The purpose of the network was to complement the International Monetary Fund's longer-term credit facilities by giving central banks instant access to funds they might need for a short period in order to move fast and vigorously in defense of their currencies. Its effectiveness was not long in being put to the test. Between its initiation in 1961 and the autumn of 1964, the swap network had played a major part in the triumphant defense against sudden and violent speculative attacks on at least three currencies: the pound, late in 1961, the Canadian dollar in June 1961, the Canadian dollar in March 1964. By the autumn of 1964, the swap agreements L-Accord de Swap to the French, Die Swap, Verpflichtungen to the Germans, had come to be the very cornerstone of international monetary cooperation. Indeed, the $500 million American dollars that the Bank of England was finding it necessary to draw on at the very moment the bank's top officers were heading for Basel that November weekend represented part of the swap network greatly expanded from its comparatively modest beginnings. As for the Bank for International Settlements, in its capacity as a banking institution, it was a relatively minor cog in all this machinery, but in its capacity as a club, it had over the years come to play a far from unimportant role. Its monthly board meetings served, and still serve, as a chance for the central bankers to talk in an informal atmosphere, to exchange gossip, views, and hunches, such as could not comfortably be indulged in either by mail or over the international telephone circuits. Basel, a medieval Rhenish city that is dominated by the spires of its 12th century Gothic cathedral, and has long been a thriving center of the chemical industry, was originally chosen as the site of the Bank for International Settlements because it was a nodal point for European railways. Now that most international bankers habitually travel by plane, that asset has become a liability, for there is no long-distance air service to Basel. Delegates must deplane at Zurich and continue by train or car. On the other hand, Basel has several first-rate restaurants, and it may be that in the view of the central bank, delegates this advantage outweighs the travel inconvenience, for central banking, or at least European central banking, has a firmly established association with good living. A governor of the National Bank of Belgium once remarked to a visitor without a smile that he considered one of his duties to be that of leaving the institution's wine cellar better than he had found it. A lunching guest at the Bank of France is generally told apologetically, in the tradition of the bank, we serve only simple fare. But what follows is a repast during which the constant discussion of vintages makes any discussion of banking awkward, if not impossible, and at which the tradition of simplicity is honored, apparently, by the serving of only one wine before the cognac. The table of the Bank of Italy is equally elegant, some say the best in Rome, and its surroundings are enhanced by the priceless Renaissance paintings acquired as defaulted security on bad loans over the years that hang on the walls. As for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, alcohol in any form is hardly ever served there. Banking is habitually discussed at meals, and the mistress of the kitchen appears almost pathetically grateful whenever one of the officers makes any sort of comment, even a critical one, on the fare. But then, Liberty Street isn't Europe. In these democratic times, central banking in Europe is thought of as the last stronghold of the aristocratic banking tradition, in which wit, grace, and culture coexist easily with commercial astuteness and even ruthlessness. The European counterparts of the security guards on Liberty Street are apt to be attendants in morning coats. Until less than a generation ago, formality of address between central bankers was the rule. Some think that the first to break it were the British during the Second World War when, it is alleged, a secret order went out that British government and military authorities were to address their American counterparts by their first names. In any event, first names are frequently exchanged between European and American central bankers now, and one reason for this, unquestionably, is the post-war rise in influence of the dollar. Another reason is that in the emerging era of cooperation, the central bankers see more of each other than they used to, not just in Basel but in Washington, Paris, and Brussels at regular meetings of perhaps half a dozen special banking eddies of various international organizations. The same handful of top bankers parades so regularly through the hotel lobbies of those cities that one of them thinks they must give the impression of being 100 strong, like the spear carriers who cross the stage again and again in the triumphal scene of Ida. And language, like the manner of its use, has tended to follow economic power. European central bankers have always used French, bad French, some say, in talking with each other, but during the long period in which the pound was the world's leading currency, English came to be the first language of central banking at large, and under the rule of the dollar it continues to be. It is spoken fluently and willingly by all the top officers of every central bank except the Bank of France, and even the Bank of France officers are forced to keep translators at hand, in consideration of the seeming intractable inability or unwillingness of most Britons and Americans to become competent in any language but their own. Lord Cromer, flouting tradition, speaks French with complete authority. At Basel, good food and convenience come before splendor. Many of the delegates favor an outwardly humble restaurant in the main railroad station, and the Bank for International Settlements itself is modestly situated between a tea shop and a hairdressing establishment. On that November weekend in 1964, Vice President Coombs was the only representative of the Federal Reserve System on hand, and indeed, he was to be the key banking representative of the United States through the early and middle phases of the crisis that was then mounting. In an abstracted way, Coombs ate and drank heartily with the others. True to his institution's traditions, he is less than a gourmet, but his real interest was in getting the sense of the meeting and the private feelings of its participants. He was the perfect man for this task, inasmuch as he has the unquestioning trust and respect of all his foreign colleagues. The other leading central bankers habitually call him by his first name, less, it seems, in deference to changed custom than out of deep affection and admiration. They also use it in speaking of him among themselves. The name Charlie Coombs, run together thus out of long habituation, is a word to conjure with in central banking circles. Charlie Coombs, they will tell you, is the kind of New Englander. He is from Newton, Massachusetts, who, although his clipped speech and dry manner make him seem a bit cool and detached, is really warm and intuitive. Charlie Coombs, although a Harvard graduate class of 1940, is the kind of unpretentious gray-haired man with half-rimmed spectacles and a precise manner whom you might easily take for a standard American small-town bank president, rather than a master of one of the world's most complex skills. It is generally conceded that if any one man was the genius behind the swap network, the man was the New England swapper Charlie Coombs. At Basel, there was, as usual, a series of formal sessions, each with its agenda. But there was also, as usual, much informal palaver and rump sessions held in hotel rooms and offices and at a formal Sunday night dinner, at which there was no agenda but instead a free discussion of what Coombs had since referred to as the hottest topic of the moment. There could be no question about what that was. It was the condition of the pound. And indeed, Coombs had heard little discussion of anything else all weekend. It was clear to me from what I heard that confidence in sterling was deteriorating, he has said. Two questions were on most of the bankers' minds. One was whether the Bank of England proposed to take some of the pressure off the pound by raising its lending rate. Bank of England men were present, but getting an answer was not a simple matter of asking them their intentions. Even if they had been willing to say, they would not have been able to because the Bank of England is not empowered to change its rate without the approval, which in practice often comes closer to meaning the instruction of the British government, and elected governments have a natural dislike for measures that make money tight. The other question was whether Britain had enough gold and dollars to throw into the breach if the speculative assault should continue. Apart from what was left of the $1 billion from the expanded swap network and what remained of its drawing rights on the International Monetary Fund, Britain had only its official reserves, which had dropped in the previous week to something under $2.5 billion, their lowest point in several years. Worse than that was the frightful rate at which the reserves were dwindling away. On a single bad day during the previous week, according to the guesses of experts, they had dropped by $87 million. A month of days like that and they would be gone. Even so, Coombs has said nobody at Basel that weekend dreamed that the pressure on sterling could become as intense as it actually did become later in the month. He returned to New York worried but resolute. It was not to New York, however, that the main scene of the battle for sterling shifted after the Basel meeting. It was to London. The big immediate question was whether or not Britain would raise its bank rate that week, and the day the answer would be known was Thursday, November 12th, in the matter of the bank rate. As in so many other things, the British customarily follow a ritual. If there is to be a change, at noon on Thursday, then and then only, a sign appears in the ground floor lobby of the Bank of England announcing the new rate, and simultaneously a functionary called the government broker, decked out in a pink coat and top hat, hurries down Throgmorton Street to the London Stock Exchange and ceremonially announces the new rate from a rostrum. Noon on Thursday the 12th passed with no change. Evidently, the Labour government was having as much trouble deciding on a bank rate rise after the election as the Conservatives had had before. The speculators, wherever they were, reacted to such pusillanimity as one man. On Friday the 13th, the pound, which had been moderately buoyant all week precisely because speculators had been anticipating a bank rate rise, underwent a fearful battering which sent it down to a closing price of $2.07,829. Barely more than a quarter of a cent above the official minimum, and the Bank of England, intervening frequently to hold it even at that level, lost $28 million more from its reserve. Next day, the financial commentator of the London Times, under the byline "Our City Editor," let himself go. The pound, he wrote, is not looking as firm as might be hoped. The following week saw the pattern repeated, but in exaggerated form. On Monday, Prime Minister Wilson, taking a leaf out of Winston Churchill's book, tried rhetoric as a weapon. Speaking at a pomp and circumstance banquet at the Guildhall in the City of London before an audience that included, among many other dignitaries, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord President of the Council, the Lord Privy Seal, the Lord Privy Seal, the Lord Mayor of London and their wives, Wilson ringingly proclaimed not only our faith but our determination to keep sterling strong and to see it riding high, and asserted that the government would not hesitate to take whatever steps might become necessary to accomplish this purpose, while elaborately avoiding the dread word devaluation, just as all other British officials had avoided it all summer. Wilson sought to make it unmistakable that the government now considered such a move out of the question. To emphasize this point, he included a warning to speculators. If anyone at home or abroad doubts the firmness of Resolve, let them be prepared to pay the price for their lack of faith in Britain. Perhaps the speculators were daunted by this verbal volley, or perhaps they were again moved to let up in their assault on the pound by the prospect of a bank rate rise on Thursday. In any case, on Tuesday and Wednesday the pound, though it hardly rode high in the marketplace, managed to ride up, little less low than it had on the previous Friday, and to do so without the help of the Bank of England. By Thursday, according to subsequent reports, a sharp private dispute had erupted between the Bank of England and the British government on the bank rate question. Lord Cromer arguing for the bank that a rise of at least 1% and perhaps 2% was absolutely essential, and perhaps 2% was absolutely essential. Wilson, Brown, and Callaghan still demurring. The upshot was no bank rate rise on Thursday, and the effect of the inaction was a swift intensification of the crisis. Friday the 20th was a black day in the City of London. The stock exchange, its investors moving in time with sterling, had a terrible session. The Bank of England had by now resolved to establish its last line trench on the pound at $2, 7,825 cents, a quarter of a cent above the bottom limit. The pound opened on Friday at precisely that level and remained there all day, firmly pinned down by the speculators' hail of offers to sell. Meanwhile, the bank met all offers at $2, 7,825 cents, and in doing so, used up more of Britain's reserve. Now the offers were coming so fast that little attempt was made to disguise their places of origin. It was evident that they were coming from everywhere, chiefly from the financial centers of Europe, but also from New York, and even from London itself. Rumors of imminent devaluation were sweeping the bourses of the continent. And in London itself, an ominous sign of cracking morale appeared. Devaluation was now being mentioned openly even there. The Swedish economist and sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, in a luncheon speech in London on Thursday, had suggested that a slight devaluation might now be the only possible solution to Britain's problems. Once this exogenous comment had broken the ice, Britons also began using the dread word, and in the next morning's Times, our city editor himself was to say, in the tone of a commander preparing the garrison for possible surrender, "Indiscriminate gossip about devaluation of the pound can do harm, but it would be even worse to regard use of that word as taboo." When nightfall at last brought the pound and its defenders a weekend breather, the Bank of England had a chance to assess its situation. What it found was anything but reassuring. All but a fraction of the $1 billion it had arranged to borrow in September under the expanded swap agreements had gone into the battle. The right that remained to it of drawing on the International Monetary Fund was virtually worthless, since the transaction would take weeks to complete, and matters turned on days and hours. What the bank still had, and all that it had, was the British reserves, which had gone down by $56 million that day, and now stood at around $2 billion. More than one commentator has since suggested that this sum could in a way be likened to the few squadrons of fighter planes to which the same dogged nation had been reduced 24 years earlier at the worst point in the Battle of Britain. The analogy is extravagant, and yet in the light of what the pound means and has meant to the British, it is not irrelevant. In the materialistic age, the pound has almost the symbolic importance that was once accorded to the crown. The state of sterling almost is the state of Britain. The pound is the oldest of modern currencies. The term pound sterling is believed to have originated well before the Norman conquest, when the Saxon kings issued silver pennies, called sterlings or starlings, because they sometimes had stars inscribed on them, of which 240 equaled 1 pound of pure silver. The shilling, representing 12 sterlings or 1/20th of a pound, did not appear on the scene until after the conquest. Thus, sizable payments in Britain have been reckoned in pounds from its beginnings. The pound, however, was by no means an unassailably sound currency during its first few centuries, chiefly because of the early kings' unfortunate habit of relieving their chronic financial embarrassment by debasing the coinage. By melting down a quantity of sterlings, adding to the brew some base metal and no more silver, and then minting new coins, an irresponsible king could magically convert 100 pounds into, say, 110, just like that. Queen Elizabeth I put a stop to the practice when, in a carefully planned surprise move in 1561, she recalled from circulation all the debased coins issued by her predecessors. The result, combined with the growth of British trade, was a rapid and spectacular rise in the prestige of the pound. In less than a century after Elizabeth's coup, the word sterling had assumed the adjectival meaning that it still has: thoroughly excellent, capable of standing every test. By the end of the 17th century, when the Bank of England was founded to handle the government's finances, paper money was beginning to be trusted for general use, and it had come to be backed by gold as well as silver. As time went on, the monetary prestige of gold rose steadily in relation to that of silver. In the modern world, silver has no standing as a monetary reserve metal, and only in some half-dozen countries does it now serve as the principal metal in subsidiary coinage. But it was not until 1816 that Britain adopted a gold standard, that is, pledged itself to redeem paper currency with gold coins or bars at any time. The gold sovereign, worth 1 pound, which came to symbolize stability, affluence, and even joy to more Victorians than beige hot, made its first appearance in 1817. Prosperity begat emulation. Seeing how Britain flourished and believing the gold standard to be at least partly responsible, other nations adopted it one after another. Germany in 1870, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark in 1873, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, and Greece in 1874, the Netherlands in 1874, the Netherlands in 1875, and the United in 1879. The results were disappointing. Hardly any of the newcomers found themselves immediately getting rich. And Britain, which in retrospect appears to have flourished as much in spite of the gold standard as because of it, continued to be the undisputed monarch of world trade. In the half-century preceding the First World War, London was the middleman in international finance, and the pound was its quasi-official medium. As David Lloyd George was later to write nostalgically, prior to 1914, the crackle of a bill on London, that is, of a bill of credit in pounds sterling bearing the signature of a London bank, was as good as the ring of gold in any port throughout the civilized world. The war ended this idyll by disrupting the delicate balance of forces that had made it possible, and by bringing to the fore a challenger to the pound supremacy, the United States dollar. In 1914, Britain, hard-pressed to finance its fighting forces, adopted measures to discourage demands for gold, thereby abandoning the gold standard in everything but name. Meanwhile, the value of a pound in dollars sank from $4.86 to a 1920 low of $3.20. In an effort to recoup its lost glory, Britain resumed a full gold standard in 1925, tying the pound to gold at a rate that restored its old $4.86 relation to the dollar. The cost of this gallant overvaluation, however, was chronic depression at home, not to mention the political eclipse for some 15 years of the Chancellor of the Exchequer who ordered it, Winston Churchill. The general collapse of currencies during the 1930s actually began not in London, but on the continent, when, in the summer of 1931, a sudden run on the leading bank of Austria, the credit installed, resulted in its failure. The domino principle of bank failures, if such a thing can be said to exist, then came into play. German losses arising from this relatively minor disaster resulted in a banking crisis in Germany. And then, because huge quantities of British funds were now frozen in bankrupt institutions on the continent, the panic crossed the English Channel and invaded the home of the imperial pound itself. Demands for gold in exchange for pounds quickly became too heavy for the Bank of England to meet, even with the help of loans from France and the United States. Britain was faced with the bleak alternatives of setting an almost usurious bank rate, between 8 and 10%, in order to hold funds in London and check the gold outflow, or abandoning the gold standard, the first choice, which would have further depressed the domestic economy in which there were now more than 2.5 million unemployed, was considered unconscionable, and accordingly on September 21, 1931, the Bank of England announced suspension of its responsibility to sell gold. The move hit the financial world like a thunderbolt. So great was the prestige of the pound in 1931 that John Maynard Keynes, the already famous British economist, could say, not wholly in irony, that sterling hadn't left gold. Gold had left sterling. In either case, the mooring of the old system was gone, and chaos was the result. Within a few weeks, all the countries on the vast portion of the globe then under British political or economic domination had left the gold standard. Most of the other leading currencies had either left gold or been drastically devalued in relation to it. And in the free market, the value of the pound in terms of dollars had dropped from $4.86 to around $3.50. Then the dollar itself, the potential new mooring, came loose. In 1933, the United States, compelled by the worst depression in its history, abandoned the gold standard. A year later, it resumed it in a modified form called the gold exchange standard, under which gold coinage was ended, and the Federal Reserve was pledged to sell gold in bar form to other central banks, but to no one else, and to sell it at a drastic devaluation of 41% from the price. The United States devaluation restored the pound to its old dollar parity, but Britain found it small comfort to be tied securely to a mooring that was now shaky itself. Even so, over the next 5 years, while beggar my neighbor came to be the rule in international finance, the pound did not lose much more ground in relation to other currencies. And when the Second World War broke out, the British government boldly pegged it at $4.03 and imposed controls to keep it there in defiance of the free market. There for a decade it remained. but only officially. In the free market of neutral Switzerland, it fluctuated all through the war in reflection of Britain's military fortunes, sinking at the darkest moments to as low as $2. In the post-war era, the pound has been almost continuously in trouble. The new rules of the game of international finance that were agreed upon at Bretton Woods recognized that the old gold standard had been far too rigid and the virtual paper standard of the 1930s far too unstable. A compromise accordingly emerged under which the dollar, the new king of the dollar currencies, remained tied to gold under the gold exchange standard, and the pound, along with the other leading currencies, became tied not to gold, but to the dollar, at rates fixed within stated limits. Indeed, the post-war era was virtually ushered in by a devaluation of the pound that was about as drastic an amount as that of 1931, though far less so in its consequences. The pound, like most European currencies, had emerged from Bretton Woods flagrantly overvalued in relation to the shattered economy it represented, and had been kept that way only by government-imposed controls. In the autumn of 1949, therefore, after a year and a half of devaluation rumors, burgeoning black markets in sterling, and gold losses that had reduced the British reserves to a dangerously low level, the pound was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80 to $2.80. With the isolated exceptions of the United States dollar and the Swiss franc, every important non-communist currency almost instantly followed the pound's example. But this time no drying up of trade or other chaos ensued, because the 1949 devaluations, unlike those of 1931 and the years following, were not the uncontrolled attempts of countries riddled by depression to gain a competitive advantage at any cost, but merely represented recognition by the war. Devastated countries that they had recovered to the point where they could survive relatively free international competition, without artificial props. In fact, world trade, instead of drying up, picked up sharply. But even at the new, more rational evaluation, the pound continued its career of hairbreadth escape. Sterling crises of varying magnitudes were weathered in 1952, 1955, 1957, and 1961. In its unsentimental and tactless way, the pound, just as by its gyrations in the past it had accurately charted Britain's rise and fall as the greatest of world powers, now, with its nagging recurrent weakness, seemed to be hinting that even such retrenchment as the British had undertaken in 1949 was not enough to suit their reduced circumstances. And in November 1964, these hints, with their humiliating implications, were not lost on the British people. The emotional terms in which many of them were thinking about the pound were well illustrated by an exchange that took place in that celebrated forum, the letters column of the Times, when the crisis was at its height. A reader named I.M.D. Little wrote, deploring all the breastbeating about the pound, and particularly the uneasy whispering about devaluation, a matter that he declared to be an economic rather than a moral issue. Quick as a flash came a reply from A.C.S. Hatfield, among others. Was there ever a clearer sign of soulless times, Hatfield demanded, than Little's letter? Devaluation not a moral issue? Repudiation. For that is what devaluation is, neither more nor less, has become respectable. Hatfield groaned in the unmistakable tone, as old in Britain as the pound itself, of the outraged patriot. In the 10 days following the Basel meeting, the first concern of the men at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was not the pound, but the dollar. The American balance of payments deficit had now crept up to the alarming rate of almost $6 billion a year, and it was becoming clear that a rise in the British bank rate, if it should be unmatched by American action, might merely shift some of the speculative attack from the pound to the dollar. Hayes and Coombs and the Washington monetary authorities, William McKesney Martin, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Secretary of the Treasury Douglas Dillon, and Under Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rousseau, came to agree that if the British should raise their rate, the Federal Reserve would be compelled, in self-defense, to competitively raise its rate above the current level of 3.5%. Hayes had numerous telephone conversations on this delicate point with his London counterpart, Lord Cromer, a deep-dyed aristocrat, a godson of King George V and a grandson of Sir Evelyn Baring. Later the first Earl of Cromer, who, as the British agent in Egypt, was Chinese Gordon's nemesis in 1884-85. Lord Cromer was also a banker of universally acknowledged brilliance and, at 43, the youngest man, as far as anyone could remember, ever to direct the fortunes of the Bank of England. He and Hayes, in the course of their frequent meetings at Basel and elsewhere, had become warm friends. During the afternoon of Friday the 20th, at any rate, the Federal Reserve Bank had a chance to show its good intentions by doing some front-line fighting for the pound. The breather provided by the London closing proved to be illusory. 5 o'clock in London was only noon in New York, and insatiable speculators were able to go on selling pounds for several more hours in the New York market, with the result that the trading room of the Federal Reserve Bank temporarily replaced that of the Bank of England as the command post for the defense. Using as their ammunition British dollars, or more precisely, United States dollars lent to Britain under the swap agreements, the Federal Reserve's traders staunchly held the pound at or above $2, 7,825 cents at ever, increasing cost, of course, to the British Reserve. Mercifully, after the New York closing, the battle did not follow the sun to San Francisco and on around the world to Tokyo. Evidently, the attackers had had their fill, at least for the time being. What followed was one of those strange modern weekends in which weighty matters are discussed and weighty decisions taken among men who are ostensibly sitting around relaxing in various parts of the world. Wilson, Brown, and Callaghan were at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country estate, taking part in a conference that had originally been scheduled to cover the subject of national defense policy. Lord Cromer was at his country place in Westerham, Kent. Martin, Dillon, and Rosa were at their offices or their homes in and around Washington. Coombs was at his home in Green Village, New Jersey, and Hayes was visiting friends of his elsewhere in New Jersey. At Chequers, Wilson and his two financial ministers, leaving the military brass to confer about defense policy with each other, adjourned to an upstairs gallery to tackle the sterling crisis. In order to bring Lord Cromer into their deliberations, they kept a telephone circuit open to him in Kent, using a scrambler system when they talked on it so as to avoid interception of their words by their unseen enemies, the speculators. Sometime on Saturday, the British reached their decision. Not only would they raise the bank rate and raise it 2% above its current level, to 7%, but in defiance of custom, they would do so the first thing Monday morning rather than wait for another Thursday to roll around. For one thing, they reasoned, to postpone action until Thursday would mean 3.5 more business days during which the deadly drain of British reserves would almost certainly continue and might well accelerate. For another, the sheer shock of the deliberate violation of custom would serve to dramatize the government's determination. The decision, once taken, was communicated by British intermediaries in Washington to the American monetary officials there and relayed to Hayes and Coombs in New Jersey. Those two, knowing that the agreed-upon plan for a concomitant rise in the New York bank rate would now have to be put into effect as quickly as possible, got to work on the telephone lining up a Monday afternoon meeting of the Federal Reserve Bank's Board of Directors, without whose initiative the rate could not be changed. Hayes, a man who sets great store by politeness, has since said with considerable chagrin that he fears he was the despair of his hostess that weekend. Not only was he on the telephone most of the time, but he was prevented by the circumstances from giving the slightest explanation of his unseemly behavior. What had been done, or rather was about to be done, in Britain was plenty to flutter the dovecotes of international finance. Since the beginning of the First World War, the bank rate there had never gone higher than 7% and had only occasionally gone that high. As for a bank rate change on a day other than Thursday, the last time that it occurred, ominously enough, was in 1931. Anticipating lively action at the London opening, which would take place at about 5 a.m., New York time, Coombs went to Liberty Street on Sunday afternoon in order to spend the night at the bank and be on hand when the transatlantic doings began. As an overnight companion, he had a man who found it advisable to sleep at the bank so often that he habitually kept a packed suitcase in his office. Thomas J. Roche, at that time the senior foreign exchange officer. Roche welcomed his boss to the sleeping quarters, a row of small, motel-like rooms on the 11th floor, each equipped with maple furniture, old New York prints, a telephone, a clock radio, a bathrobe, and a shaving kit. And the two men discussed the weekend's developments for a while before turning in. Shortly before 5 in the morning, their radios woke them, and after a breakfast provided by the night staff, they repaired to the foreign exchange trading room on the 7th floor to man their fluoroscope. At 5:10, they were on the phone to the Bank of England, getting the news. The bank rate rise had been announced promptly at the opening of the London markets, to the accompaniment of great excitement. Later, Coombs was to learn that the government broker's entrance into the stock exchange, which is usually the occasion for a certain hush, had this time been greeted with such an uproar that he had had difficulty making his news known. As for the first market reaction of the pound, it was, one commentator said later, like that of a racehorse to dope. In the 10 minutes following the bank rate announcement, it shot up to $2, 7,869 cents, far above its fray closing. A few minutes later, the early rising New Yorkers were on the phone to the Deutsche Bundesbank, the central bank of West Germany in Frankfurt, and the Swiss National Bank in Zurich, sounding out continental reaction. It was equally good. Then they were back in touch with the Bank of England, where things were looking better and better. The speculators against the pound were on the run, rushing now to cover their short sales, and by the time the first gray light began to show in the windows on Liberty Street, Coombs had heard that the pound was being quoted in London